Tonight we're going to walk through one of survival horror's most pivotal journeys, a story about a government agent sent into rural Spain on what should have been a straightforward rescue mission, only to find himself trapped in a nightmare of parasites, cults, and impossible choices. This is the complete story of Resident Evil 4, told in full, with every detail preserved. Close your eyes if you'd like. We're going to move slowly through this, examining how Leon S. Kennedy's mission unfolded across fog-shrouded villages, Gothic castles, and remote islands where faith twisted into fanaticism and salvation became indistinguishable from damnation. We'll trace Leon's path from the moment his car crosses into Spanish countryside to his final escape across dark waters, noting every ally gained and lost, every revelation about the parasites controlling the region, and every confrontation that brought him closer to understanding what Los Illuminados truly wanted. No rush, no urgency, just a careful reconstruction of those days in autumn of 2004 when an American agent found himself alone against an army of the infected, armed with little more than determination and the fading hope that Ashley Graham could still be saved. Before we begin Leon's story proper, we need to understand what came before. We need to know who Leon Kennedy was when he arrived in Spain, what shaped him into the man capable of surviving what awaited in those villages, and why the United States government trusted him with a mission this sensitive. His journey to that Spanish countryside began years earlier, in another doomed location where biological horror first taught him that survival requires more than training. The man before Spain, 6 years before Leon Kennedy would set foot in rural Spain, he was a rookie, fresh out of the police academy, 21 years old, and about to start his first day as an officer with the Raccoon City Police Department. The date was September 29th, 1998. He'd spent the previous night drinking, nursing a breakup, trying to steel himself for the new chapter of his life that would begin the following morning. When he woke with a hangover and checked his messages, he found a frantic warning from a fellow officer telling him not to come to Raccoon City, that something terrible had happened. Leon came anyway, duty or perhaps stubbornness, or maybe just the inability to process that a warning of that magnitude could be real. He drove into Raccoon City in the early hours of September 30th and found a metropolis in collapse. The T-virus, a biological weapon developed by the Umbrella Corporation, had been released into the city's population through contaminated water. The infection spread rapidly, turning citizens into mindless zombies driven by base hunger. By the time Leon arrived, the city was already lost, its streets filled with the shambling dead, and worse things still being born from Umbrella's experiments. Leon survived that night through a combination of luck, instinct, and an alliance with Claire Redfield, a college student searching for her brother. Together they navigated the ruined police station, the sewers beneath the city, and finally the underground laboratory where Umbrella had conducted its research. They encountered William Birkin, a scientist who had injected himself with the G virus and transformed into something no longer human. They watched as the samples and research that might have explained everything burned in fires meant to cover Umbrella's crimes, and they escaped just before the United States government sterilized the entire city with a nuclear strike, erasing Raccoon City from the map along with all evidence of what had occurred there. That night changed Leon fundamentally. He entered Raccoon City as a naive rookie, expecting to write traffic citation and file incident reports. He left as one of the few survivors of a biological catastrophe that claimed over 100,000 lives. The United States government took immediate interest in him. They debriefed him extensively, examining every detail of his account. Then they made him an offer he couldn't realistically refuse: join a specialized government agency being formed to deal with bioterrorism threats, or face the possibility that his knowledge of Raccoon City made him a security liability. Leon accepted. Over the following years, he underwent intensive training that transformed him from a cop who got lucky into a genuinely capable special agent. He learned advanced combat techniques, infiltration methods, tactical analysis, and how to maintain composure in situations that would break most people. He was paired with experienced operatives who taught him how to think several moves ahead, how to read environments for threats, and how to make the split-second decisions that mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. One of those operatives was Jack Krauser, a veteran soldier with the United States Special Operations Command. Krauser became something between a mentor and a rival to Leon, pushing him harder than any other instructor, demanding perfection in every drill and exercise. Their relationship was complicated, built on mutual respect and an underlying tension that neither man fully acknowledged. In 2002, they were sent together on a mission to South America known as Operation Javier, tasked with investigating reports of bioorganic weapons being used by a drug cartel. Operation Javier went badly. The details remain classified, but what's known is that Leon and Krauser encountered bioorganic threats even more dangerous than what Leon had faced in Raccoon City. The mission succeeded in its objectives, but Krauser was severely wounded in the process. He claimed to have lost function in his arm, an injury that ended his field career. The military forced him into early retirement, and Leon lost track of his former mentor. Official records listed Krauser as having died in a helicopter accident in late 2002. Leon continued his work with the government, taking on increasingly dangerous assignments that dealt with Umbrella Corporation remnants and other bioterrorism threats. He became one of the most trusted agents in his division, known for completing missions that seemed impossible and for maintaining his humanity even when surrounded by horror. By 2004, he had earned a reputation within the intelligence community as someone who could be sent into the worst situations with confidence that he would either succeed or die trying, and that he would never compromise his principles in the process. It was this reputation that led to him being selected for the Ashley Graham extraction. When the president's daughter was kidnapped by an unknown group and intelligence traced her location to rural Spain, the government needed someone who could operate independently in hostile territory, who had experience with biological threats, and who could be trusted absolutely with a mission of this sensitivity. Leon Kennedy checked every box. They briefed him on what little they knew, gave him minimal support, and sent him into the Spanish countryside with the expectation that he would either bring Ashley Graham home or confirm her death so the government could respond accordingly. Leon drove into rural Spain in early autumn of 2004 with two local police officers who were meant to guide him to the village where intelligence suggested Ashley was being held. The officers dropped him near the outskirts of the region and wished him luck, with a tone that suggested they knew more than they were saying. Leon proceeded on foot, following a dirt path that led deeper into forested hills where the fog gathered thick and the afternoon light struggled to penetrate the canopy. The first house he came to sat alone in a clearing, isolated and somehow wrong in ways Leon couldn't immediately articulate. Smoke rose from its chimney. A light burned in one window. He approached cautiously, knocked on the door, and received no answer. When he entered, weapon drawn, he found the interior dim and cluttered with the accumulated possessions of rural poverty. A fire burned in the hearth. Something was cooking in a pot. And in the back room, Leon found a man hunched over something Leon couldn't quite see. When Leon identified himself and asked about a missing girl. The man turned slowly. His eyes were wrong, not the glassy stare of the undead Leon had encountered in Raccoon City, but something else, a dull malevolence, an intelligence that was present but twisted. The man didn't respond to questions. Instead, he picked up an axe and attacked with sudden, terrifying focus. Leon defended himself, putting the man down with shots that would have stopped anyone. But even as that threat ended, Leon heard more movement outside. Through the windows, he could see figures emerging from the fog and the surrounding buildings. Men and women in rural clothes carrying farming implements and weapons improvised from tools. They moved with purpose toward the house, and Leon realized with creeping dread that whatever had taken the first man had taken all of them. He barricaded the door and prepared for a siege, but the villagers didn't behave like the zombies of Raccoon City. They coordinated. They used tools to break through barricades. They communicated with each other in Spanish, their words slurred and strange, but still language. These weren't the mindless dead. These were infected people who retained enough intelligence to be far more dangerous than anything Leon had faced before. The assault on that first house would set the tone for everything that followed. Leon fought his way through waves of villagers who should have died from wounds but kept attacking until catastrophic damage finally dropped them. He scavenged ammunition from the house and the surrounding buildings, finding evidence that the villagers had been preparing for something, stockpiling weapons and resources. And when the church bell rang in the distance, all the surviving villagers stopped their attack and walked away as if summoned, leaving Leon alive but shaken in the ruins of his defensive position. He tried to contact his handler, Ingrid Hunnigan, through his radio. The connection was poor but functional. He reported that the village was hostile, that the population appeared to be infected with something, and that he was continuing toward the area where intelligence suggested Ashley was being held. Hunnigan acknowledged his report with concern in her voice and warned him that extraction might be difficult if the entire region was compromised. Leon confirmed he understood and pressed forward, following the path deeper into the village proper. The village itself was a nightmare of rural European architecture transformed into a war zone. Buildings showed signs of recent violence. Bodies hung from posts and scaffolds, displayed as warnings or trophies. The remaining villagers moved through the streets with that same coordinated purpose, and when they spotted Leon, they attacked immediately. He fought through them, noting that their behavior was too organized for simple infection. They set traps, they flanked him, they used the environment tactically. In the village square, Leon encountered something that made the situation even clearer. A villager wielding a chainsaw, face covered by a burlap sack, emerged from one of the buildings and charged him with mechanical fury. The chainsaw would kill Leon instantly if it connected, forcing him to stay mobile, to keep distance, to waste precious ammunition on a target that absorbed damage and kept coming. When he finally put the chainsaw villager down, Leon examined the body and saw something that made his blood cold. Underneath the skin at the back of the neck, something moved. A parasite, visible through the translucent flesh, pulsing with obscene life. This wasn't a virus like in Raccoon City. This was something else, entirely. Something that lived inside the host and controlled them like a puppet. Leon continued through the village, fighting his way to a farmhouse on the outskirts where intelligence suggested Ashley might be held. He found the building locked and barricaded from outside, suggesting whoever was inside was meant to stay there. He forced entry and climbed to the second floor, where he found a young woman in an orange jacket, blonde hair dirty and disheveled, eyes wide with fear and relief when she saw he was American. Ashley Graham, the president's daughter, huddled in the corner of that room like any terrified 20-year-old would, when held captive in a foreign country by people who spoke a language she didn't understand and who looked at her with eyes that suggested she was less a person than a commodity. When Leon identified himself and explained he was there to rescue her, Ashley's relief was palpable. She asked if they were leaving immediately, if there was a helicopter coming, if her father had sent an army. Leon had to explain that extraction was complicated, that the entire region was hostile, that they would need to make their way to a safer location before support could reach them. Ashley took the news with more composure than Leon expected, perhaps because any plan was better than continued captivity. She followed him down the stairs and out into the village, staying close as Leon led her through streets now even more dangerous because he couldn't focus solely on threats ahead. Almost immediately they were captured. The villagers swarmed them in numbers that made fighting impractical. Leon tried to hold them off, but something struck him from behind, and consciousness fled in a wave of gray static. When he woke, he was in a different location entirely, and everything had changed in ways that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The parasite's gift. Leon woke in dim light with his head pounding and his memory fractured. He was lying on a floor of stone or concrete, arms and legs unrestrained but body sluggish, as if drugged. As awareness returned, he registered another presence nearby, a man, also waking, groaning as consciousness brought back the pain of whatever had been done to them. The man introduced himself as Luis Serra, Spanish, early 30s, with the manner of someone educated but desperate. He claimed to be a former police officer from Madrid who had come to this region investigating reports of missing persons and found himself caught by the same villagers who had taken Leon. His story had holes that Leon noticed immediately, but in their current situation, questions about Luis's background seemed less important than figuring out where they were and how to escape. They were in a small stone structure, possibly a storage building or old cellar. The door was locked from outside. There were no windows. Before they could formulate an escape plan, the door opened and a massive figure entered. The man was easily 7 feet, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a long coat and a wide-brimmed hat that cast his face in shadow. He moved with authority that suggested leadership, and when he spoke it was with a voice that rumbled like distant thunder. This was Vitoris Mendez, the village chief. He looked at Leon and Luis the way a farmer might examine cattle, assessing value and purpose. Then he did something that transformed the situation from dangerous to nightmarish. Mendez removed his coat and revealed that his body was wrong. His torso was too long, vertebrae visible through the skin, spine curved in ways human spines shouldn't curve, and from his back, writhing with hideous life, emerged the parasite. It was called Las Plagas, Mendez explained in broken English, an ancient organism that had been sealed away by the Salazar family centuries ago, kept buried and forgotten until recent excavation had released it. The parasite granted strength, granted purpose, granted connection to something greater than individual will, and both Leon and Luis had already been infected. The plagas had been injected into them while they were unconscious, and even now the organisms were taking root in their nervous systems. Mendez left them with that revelation, locking the door behind him. Luis immediately panicked, explaining that he knew what Las Plagas did because he had worked with the cult that controlled them. He had been a researcher for Los Illuminados, the religious organization that had excavated the parasites and begun infecting the local population. He had helped develop methods to cultivate and control the plagas before realizing the full scope of what Sadler planned. Now he was trying to escape, trying to undo some of the damage he had helped cause. Leon forced himself to focus past the horror of infection. They needed to escape immediately. They needed to find Ashley, who had presumably also been taken during the capture, and they needed to find a way to remove the parasites before they reached maturity, and Leon lost his free will entirely. They broke out of the holding area through a combination of Luis's knowledge of the cult's facilities and Leon's combat training. The complex they found themselves in was larger than Leon had realized, a network of buildings and underground passages where the cult conducted its operations. They fought through infected villagers who responded to their escape like antibodies attacking an infection, coordinated and relentless. Luis split off, claiming he knew where supplies might be stored that could help them. Leon continued searching for Ashley, navigating through the facility while fighting off waves of ganados, as Luis had called the infected villagers. The ganados were faster and more coordinated than the zombies Leon had faced in Raccoon City. They used weapons with practiced skill. They called out to each other, coordinating ambushes, and occasionally, when Leon damaged them severely enough, the plagas would emerge from their bodies, tentacles erupting from necks or chests, the parasites taking direct control when the host body became too damaged to function normally. Leon found Ashley being held in a church on the village's edge, a Gothic structure that had been repurposed by Los Illuminados for their worship. The interior was a blasphemous mixture of Christian iconography and occult symbols, crosses mounted alongside strange circular seals that suggested rituals older than Christianity itself. Ashley was locked in a side room, unharmed but terrified. Leon freed her, and they attempted to leave, but at the church's entrance they encountered the man who would become the face of their nightmare. Osmond Sadler stood blocking their exit with the calm assurance of someone who knew the game was already won. He was tall and imposing, wearing a purple cloak adorned with golden emblems of Los Illuminados. His voice was measured and hypnotic, each word carefully chosen for maximum impact. He welcomed Leon almost cordially, explained that both Leon and Ashley had been injected with Las Plagas, and laid out with casual cruelty exactly what would happen to them. The parasites would mature over time, Sadler explained. They would grow within Leon and Ashley's bodies, wrapping around the nervous system, sending tendrils into the brain. And when they reached full maturity, Leon and Ashley would lose their individual wills entirely. They would become ganados like the villagers, but with their intelligence and skills intact. Ashley would be sent back to the United States, back to the White House, where she would be close to the president and to the centers of American power. And through her, through the plaga controlling her, Los Illuminados would extend its influence into the highest levels of the U.S. government. Leon tried to attack Sadler, but the cult leader moved with inhuman speed, dodging easily and demonstrating strength that suggested he was more than merely human himself. Before the confrontation could escalate, Sadler simply left, walking out of the church with the assurance that there was no rush. Leon and Ashley couldn't escape the region. The parasites inside them guaranteed their eventual loyalty. Los Illuminados could afford to be patient. Leon and Ashley fled the church and attempted to find transportation out of the region. Leon contacted Hunnigan and explained the situation. They had been infected with a parasite. They had limited time before the infection reached maturity. They needed immediate extraction and medical support. Hunnigan confirmed she was working on it, but extraction from a hostile region in a foreign country took time. For now, Leon needed to keep Ashley safe and keep moving. They fought through more of the village, Leon scavenging weapons and supplies while Ashley followed close behind. The ganados pursued them relentlessly, and Leon noticed that the infection was affecting him already. Occasionally his vision would blur. He would hear whispers in Spanish, words that seemed to come from inside his own head rather than external sources. The plaga was growing, establishing its presence, beginning the long process of converting him from individual to part of Los Illuminados' hive. Luis found them again near the village's outskirts, carrying supplies he had stolen from cult facilities. He had a lead on a way to remove the parasites, but it required getting to his laboratory in another part of the region. The laboratory had equipment and samples that might be used to kill the plagas without killing the host. It was a desperate hope, but it was the only option better than waiting for the inevitable conversion. Before they could reach Luis's laboratory, they encountered Mendez again. The village chief had been tracking them, and now he was done being patient. In a barn on the edge of the village, Mendez revealed his full transformation. His body elongated impossibly, spine extending and twisting until he was more centipede than man, supported on multiple insectoid legs that emerged from his torso. The plaga had granted him strength and resilience that made him nearly unstoppable. Leon fought Mendez in that barn while Ashley hid in the rafters, using everything in his arsenal to damage the transformed chief. Mendez shrugged off wounds that would kill anyone human, regenerating damage and continuing his assault with mechanical persistence. The battle was desperate and chaotic, Leon staying mobile to avoid Mendez's charges while looking for weaknesses in the transformation. He found one in fire. The barn had barrels of oil that ignited when shot, and the flames affected Mendez more severely than bullets did. Leon used this, luring Mendez into ignited areas and unloading his most powerful weapons when the chief was distracted by burning. Eventually, accumulated damage became too much, even for Mendez's transformed body. He collapsed among the flames, the plaga in his body writhing in its death throes, and Leon and Ashley escaped the barn as it burned. Luis met them outside the village with news. He had secured a boat and found a route across the lake to the castle on the far shore. The castle was held by Ramon Salazar, the eighth castellan of the Salazar family and one of Sadler's primary lieutenants. Salazar had been the one to unseal Las Plagas in the first place, convinced by Sadler to undo his ancestors' work of sealing the parasites centuries ago. Luis's laboratory was somewhere beyond the castle, and getting to it meant going through Salazar's territory. They took the boat across the lake as evening approached, the water dark and still in ways that suggested depths better left unexamined. Partway across, something struck the boat from below. Luis tried to restart the motor while Leon looked for the source of the impact. What he saw beneath the water was impossible. Something massive, far larger than any natural creature, circled them with predatory intent. The creature surfaced near the boat, revealing itself as a monstrous salamander the size of a house. Del Lago, the locals had called it, a creature infected by Las Plagas and transformed into something out of nightmare. It had lived in the lake for years, growing to impossible size, and now it attacked the boat with the single-minded hunger that the parasite instilled in all its hosts. Leon harpooned the creature, but Del Lago simply dragged the boat behind it as it dove, pulling them through the water at speeds that threatened to capsize them entirely. The battle became a desperate fight to damage Del Lago enough that it would release them before they were dragged underwater and drowned. Leon fired harpoon after harpoon into the creature's body, each impact spurring it to greater violence. Eventually, accumulated damage or perhaps simple exhaustion caused Del Lago to slow, to sink. Leon cut the line connecting them to the dying creature before it could drag them down with it, and they drifted to the far shore in a boat, barely holding together. They made landfall as night fell fully, exhausted and soaked. Luis split off again, claiming he needed to gather supplies and that he would meet them in the castle. Leon and Ashley continued alone, approaching the castle that loomed against the night sky like something from Gothic horror fiction. all spires and battlements and windows that reflected moonlight like watching eyes. The castle's main gate was locked and reinforced, meant to withstand siege. Leon found an alternate route through a drainage system that led under the walls and into the castle's basement levels. These lower areas were ancient, predating the current structure, stone passages carved from the mountain itself, where the air tasted of centuries and water dripped from ceilings lost in shadow overhead. In those depths, Leon and Ashley encountered new varieties of infected creatures. The castle's defenders included not just ganados, but what Luis had called colmillos, dogs infected with plagas that granted them enhanced speed and the ability to regenerate from wounds that would kill normal animals. There were also armaduras, suits of armor, animated by plagas' growth inside them, moving with clanking purpose as if knights from centuries past had returned to defend their lord. They fought through the castle's lower levels and emerged into the main structure, finding themselves in a Gothic nightmare of opulent decay. The castle had been grand once, home to generations of the Salazar family and center of their feudal power over the region. Now it was Los Illuminados' stronghold, rooms repurposed for cult rituals and parasite research, tapestries depicting the family's history hanging alongside newer artwork showing Las Plagas worship. It was here that they encountered Ramon Salazar properly. The eighth Castellan was tiny, barely 4 feet tall, his body twisted by what appeared to be some form of dwarfism or growth disorder. He dressed in elaborate aristocratic fashion, all lace and velvet, speaking with an affected accent that suggested education mixed with madness. He was young, barely 20, but his eyes held the fanaticism of someone who had found purpose in zealotry. Salazar taunted them over the castle's intercom system, explaining that they were honored guests in his home and that he would personally ensure they never left. He had devoted himself entirely to Los Illuminados after Sadler had shown him the truth, after Sadler had explained that Salazar's ancestors were wrong to seal Las Plagas. The parasites were holy, Salazar insisted. They were the key to transcendence, to paradise. By releasing them, he had corrected his family's greatest failure. The castle became a maze of puzzles and traps as Salazar attempted to kill or delay them. Leon navigated through rooms where the floor would drop away without warning, through galleries where ganados attacked from hidden passages, through a hedge maze in the castle's courtyard where enemies stalked them from the fog. Ashley was captured multiple times, taken by ganados and dragged deeper into the castle, forcing Leon to pursue and rescue her repeatedly. During one of these separations, Leon encountered something that changed his understanding of the situation entirely. A figure in red moved through the castle with the fluid grace of professional skill, someone who clearly wasn't a Ganados or one of Salazar's defenders. When Leon finally cornered the figure, she revealed herself with a smile that was equal parts mockery and genuine pleasure at seeing him. Ada Wong stood before Leon in the same red dress she had worn in Raccoon City 6 years ago, looking not a day older and carrying herself with the same enigmatic confidence that had defined their previous encounters. Leon had believed she died in Raccoon City, crushed by debris during their escape from the laboratory. Seeing her alive and active in Salazar's castle raised questions Leon didn't have time to properly process. Ada claimed she was working for an unnamed organization that wanted a sample of Las Plagas for their own purposes. She wasn't with Los Illuminados, wasn't with the U.S. government, but operating as independent contractor in the same hostile territory where Leon was trying to complete his mission. She helped him briefly, providing information about the castle's layout and warning him about traps ahead, before disappearing again into the castle's passages. Leon rescued Ashley from yet another capture, and they continued deeper into the castle, following the only path that seemed to lead forward. They found Luis again in one of the castle's laboratories, surrounded by equipment he was attempting to use to synthesize a treatment for Las Plagas infection. Luis explained that complete removal was impossible without specialized surgery, but he had created pills that would slow the parasite's growth, buying them time. Before Luis could deliver the pills, Salazar appeared with his bodyguards, two massive Verdugo warriors whose bodies had been heavily modified by Las Plagas into armored insectoid forms. Salazar gloated about having caught them all, about how pleased Sadler would be. Then, almost casually, he stabbed Luis with one of his own insect-like plaga appendages that emerged from his sleeve. Luis collapsed, the wound catastrophic. Salazar and his Verdugo retreated, leaving Luis to die. Leon tried to help him, but the damage was too severe, internal organs pierced and bleeding. Luis managed to give Leon the pills before he died, explaining with his last breaths that the pills would suppress the plagas, but that Leon would need to find the actual cure on the island where Sadler's primary laboratory was located. There was a machine there, Luis gasped, that could destroy the parasites with radiation. If Leon could reach it, he and Ashley could be saved. Luis died in that laboratory, another casualty of Los Illuminados' schemes and his own attempts to make amends for his role in their creation. Leon took the pills, gave half to Ashley, and continued pursuing Salazar deeper into the castle with revenge, now added to his list of motivations. The pursuit led them to the castle's depths, to ancient chambers where the Salazar family had originally sealed Las Plagas centuries ago. Ramon Salazar waited there with his remaining Verdugo, ready to make his final stand. But before the confrontation could begin properly, Salazar did something that Leon realized too late was self-sacrifice disguised as transformation. Salazar allowed himself to be absorbed by one of the massive plaga growths in the chamber, merging his body with the parasite and with one of his Verdugo in a hideous fusion that created something far more dangerous than Salazar had been alone. The resulting creature was enormous, a writhing mass of plaga tissue with Salazar's body visible at its center, mouth opened in either ecstasy or agony, tentacles as thick as trees whipping through the chamber with crushing force. Leon fought the transformed Salazar in those ancient chambers, while Ashley remained hidden, unloading every weapon he had into the creature's weak points. The battle was exhausting, the creature regenerating damage almost as fast as Leon could inflict it, tentacles smashing down with enough force to crack stone. Eventually, Leon found the rhythm, identified the pattern in the creature's attacks, and focused fire on Salazar's human body at the center of the mass. When enough damage accumulated there, the entire plaga organism convulsed and died, collapsing into a pool of fluids and tissue that had no right existing. Ramon Salazar's body slumped in the center of the remains, barely recognizable as human anymore. The eighth Castellan of the Salazar family had died trying to serve the parasites his ancestors had wisely sealed away, his youth and faith exploited by Sadler's manipulation into sacrificing everything for a promised paradise that would never arrive. With Salazar dead, the castle began to destabilize, structural damage from the battle triggering collapses throughout the ancient structure. Leon and Ashley fled through crumbling passages, staying ahead of falling rubble, emerging finally into the castle's courtyard as the main structure collapsed behind them in a roar of stone and dust. Ada appeared again at the castle's entrance, having secured a motorboat. She offered Leon and Ashley transportation to the island where Sadler's primary facility was located, the same island where Luis had said the radiation machine could cure their infections. Her reasons for helping were unclear, but Leon didn't have better options. They took the boat and crossed the water toward the island visible in the distance, watching as the castle burned behind them, flames consuming what remained of the Salazar legacy. The island waited ahead in the darkness, and Leon knew that whatever they had faced so far was only preparation for what Sadler had waiting in his primary stronghold, the island of the damned. The island rose from dark water like a fortress, all sheer cliffs and military fortifications that suggested purposes beyond simple religious retreat. As Leon guided the motorboat toward the island's docks, he could see lights in some of the facility's windows, generators humming in the distance, evidence that Los Illuminados maintained active operations here beyond the village and castle territories. Ada disappeared immediately upon landfall, claiming she had her own objectives to pursue. Leon and Ashley proceeded alone toward the primary facility, approaching through what appeared to be a military checkpoint that had been repurposed by Los Illuminados. The ganados here were different from the villagers and castle defenders. They wore tactical gear, carried military-grade weapons, and moved with discipline that suggested training beyond what the parasites provided. These were soldiers who had been infected while already combat capable, making them far more dangerous than the farmers and servants Leon had faced previously. The facility itself was a hybrid of military base and research laboratory, concrete structures built into the island's rock with underground levels that extended deep beneath the surface. Los Illuminados had clearly been operating here for years, developing new Plagas variants, experimenting with control mechanisms, and preparing for the larger plan Sadler had hinted at. Documents Leon found scattered through the facility referenced shipments to other locations, suggestions that Los Illuminados' infection reach extended far beyond this Spanish region. Ashley was captured again, this time with frightening efficiency. Soldiers swarmed their position, separated Leon from Ashley through coordinated tactics, and extracted her before Leon could effectively respond. He pursued them deeper into the facility, fighting through waves of infected soldiers while trying to track where Ashley had been taken. The facility was a maze of identical concrete corridors, server rooms, and holding cells where other prisoners had presumably been kept before infection or execution. Leon found evidence of other operations Los Illuminados had conducted. Files referenced experiments attempting to create superior Plagas variants that could grant enhanced abilities while maintaining control. There were references to sales negotiations with terrorist organizations and hostile nations looking to acquire Plaga samples. Sadler's plan, Leon realized, went far beyond infecting Ashley and infiltrating the U.S. government. He was building an empire funded by bioweapon sales, positioning Los Illuminados as a major player in global terrorism. In one of the facility's communications rooms, Leon made contact with Hunnigan again. She had been monitoring his progress and had troubling news. The U.S. military was preparing a backup plan in case Leon's mission failed. If he couldn't secure Ashley and confirm the Plagas threat had been neutralized, the military would sterilize the entire region the same way they had sterilized Raccoon City. Leon had limited time not just to save Ashley, but to prevent another city being erased from the map. He pushed deeper into the facility and found Ashley being held in a containment area where Los Illuminados conducted their most sensitive research. She was alive, but the Plaga infection had progressed significantly, her symptoms now obvious. She was fighting it, maintaining control through sheer will, but Leon could see how much the effort cost her. They needed to find Luis's radiation machine soon, or the infection would reach the point where it couldn't be reversed. Before they could reach the machine, A familiar voice stopped Leon in the facility's central hub, a voice he hadn't heard in 2 years, belonging to someone the military had told him was dead. Jack Krauser stepped out from the shadows with a smile that held no warmth, wearing the tactical gear of Los Illuminados or elite forces, very much alive and very clearly no longer on Leon's side. Krauser explained with evident pleasure that his death had been faked, that his injury in Operation Javier had been real, but not career-ending. What had ended his career was the U.S. military's abandonment of his team, leaving them to face bioorganic threats without support. While politicians pretended the mission didn't exist, Krauser had survived, but his faith in the government he had served hadn't. When he learned about Las Plagas, he saw an opportunity to gain the power that would prevent him from ever being helpless again. He had approached Los Illuminados and offered his services. Sadler had been skeptical at first, but recognized Krauser's skills. They gave him a dominant plaga, a special variant that granted enhanced abilities while allowing the host to maintain free will and control. The transformation had given Krauser strength beyond human limits, and the ability to mutate his arm into a massive blade of bone and plaga tissue. More importantly, it had given him purpose and power that the military never could. It was Krauser who had kidnapped Ashley, Krauser who had delivered her to Los Illuminados, Krauser who had been tracking Leon through the village and castle to ensure he didn't interfere with Sadler's plans. And now Krauser would finish what should have been done in the village, killing Leon and ensuring Ashley remained in Los Illuminados' possession. They fought in the facility's central hub, mentor against student. The training sessions from years ago transformed into lethal combat. Krauser was faster and stronger than Leon remembered, the plaga enhancement making him nearly superhuman. His mutated arm struck with force that shattered concrete, and he moved with the confidence of someone who had already won. Leon had to rely on tactics and environment, using the hub's layout to create distance, targeting Krauser's unmutated parts, looking for any advantage against an opponent who surpassed him in nearly every physical metric. The battle was brutal and exhausting, both men trading wounds that would have been fatal without their respective enhancements and survival training. Krauser's confidence began to erode as Leon continued to survive, continued to adapt, continued to demonstrate the skills that Krauser himself had helped instill. Eventually, Krauser made a mistake, overextended on an attack, and Leon capitalized with a combination of grenade and focused fire that brought his former mentor down. Krauser died on the floor of the facility he had helped Los Illuminados operate, his body reverting from its plaga-enhanced state as the parasite died with him. His last words to Leon were bitter acknowledgement that maybe Leon had learned his lessons better than Krauser had anticipated. Then he was gone, another casualty of the schemes that had consumed this region. Ada appeared again, revealed that she had been tracking Krauser as well, confirmed that Sadler's laboratory was below them in the facility's deepest levels. She helped Leon access the lower levels, though her reasons remained unclear, and her loyalty to her unnamed organization prevented her from fully committing to assisting his mission. She disappeared into the facility's shadows again, leaving Leon to continue with Ashley toward the laboratory where their cure supposedly waited. The lower levels were different from the military portions above. These were pure research facilities, rooms filled with plaga samples at various stages of development, testing chambers where the parasite's effects had been studied, and documentation of every experiment Los Illuminados had conducted. Leon found evidence of dozens of failed test subjects, people who had died during attempts to create enhanced plaga variants or who had been disposed of when their usefulness ended. He found the radiation machine Luis had mentioned, a large, cylindrical chamber that could supposedly destroy Plaga's organisms inside a living host without killing the host themselves. It was powered and functional, clearly maintained as part of Los Illuminados' research infrastructure. Leon and Ashley prepared to use it, to finally cure the infections that had been threatening them since the village. Before they could activate the machine, Sadler arrived with his remaining forces. The cult leader had been allowing Leon and Ashley to move through the facility, Sadler explained, watching them struggle, measuring their capabilities. Now that they had reached the laboratory, now that they thought themselves close to salvation, Sadler would take Ashley and complete the infection process that would prepare her for return to the United States. Sadler revealed his own Plaga enhancement far beyond what Mendez or Krauser had possessed. His body transformed into something between human and arthropod, limbs extending and multiplying, eyes proliferating across his torso, a massive eye opening in his body's center that seemed to pulse with the Plaga's collective consciousness. He was less a man infected with a parasite than a human shell for the Plaga to inhabit, the fusion so complete that it was unclear where Sadler ended and the organism began. He captured Ashley with appendages that shot out faster than Leon could react, pulling her away before Leon could stop him. Then Sadler simply left with her, withdrawing deeper into the facility, confident that Leon couldn't stop him even if he managed to follow. The cult's primary forces remained behind to delay Leon, waves of infected soldiers and enhanced Plaga creatures that had been bred specifically for combat. Leon fought through them with increasing desperation, knowing that every minute that passed was another minute Ashley was in Sadler's possession, another minute closer to the infection becoming irreversible. He called for backup for any support Hunnigan could provide, and she managed to arrange for aerial assistance. A helicopter pilot named Mike arrived in an armed chopper, providing fire support through the facility's open areas, suppressing ganados and allowing Leon to advance. Mike's assistance was brief but crucial, the helicopter's weapons cutting through enemies that would have taken Leon precious minutes to handle alone. But Sadler wasn't going to allow the interference to continue. As Mike made another pass over the facility, Sadler emerged with a rocket launcher and fired with casual precision. The rocket struck Mike's helicopter in the engine, and the aircraft spiraled out of control toward the water, exploding on impact. Leon watched another ally die, another casualty in the mission that had already claimed Luis and Krauser and countless others. Rage joined desperation as motivation. He continued into the facility's deepest levels, to the primary laboratory where Sadler conducted his most critical research, where Ashley was being held for the final stage of her infection. The laboratory was vast, a cathedral-like space, carved from the island's rock, filled with plaga growths that covered walls and ceiling like organic architecture. Sadler waited at the center, with Ashley held immobile in tendrils of plaga tissue, her eyes glazed as the infection neared completion. The cult leader welcomed Leon with the same hypnotic courtesy he had shown in the church, explained that Leon had played his role perfectly as a test subject and threat assessment. Now Sadler would complete his work, infect Ashley past the point of treatment, and send her back to the United States where the plaga inside her would connect to the collective, and Los Illuminados would extend its reach into the heart of American power. And Leon would die here in this laboratory, knowing he had failed. The confrontation was interrupted by Ada, who appeared from the laboratory's upper levels and opened fire on Sadler with enough force to distract him from Ashley. Sadler responded by releasing Ashley and focusing on Ada, clearly viewing her as the greater threat. This gave Leon the opening he needed. He grabbed Ashley and pulled her to the radiation machine, fighting off Plaga tendrils while getting her into the chamber. He activated the machine, and Ashley screamed as the radiation flooded the chamber, destroying the Plaga inside her. The parasite died in writhing agony, expelled from her body in pieces. The treatment as traumatic as Luis had warned, but successful. Ashley emerged from the chamber weak but free, the infection purged. Leon quickly took his own treatment, enduring the same agony as the Plaga inside him was destroyed. Feeling the whispers that had been growing louder suddenly silence as the parasite died. They emerged from the chamber to find Sadler and Ada still engaged in their confrontation. Ada was holding her own but clearly losing ground against Sadler's transformed state. She threw something to Leon, a rocket launcher loaded with a single shot, and screamed for him to use it. Leon aimed at Sadler's central eye, the massive organ that seemed to coordinate the cult leader's plagiform, and fired. The rocket struck perfectly, and Sadler's transformation collapsed inward as catastrophic damage overwhelmed even the Plaga's regenerative abilities. The cult leader's body fell apart, separating into component pieces as the organism could no longer maintain cohesion. Sadler died in the laboratory he had built, his plans for global infection dying with him, Los Illuminados leadership decapitated in a single moment. Ada collected a sample from Sadler's remains, the dominant plaga that had been controlling the cult leader, the prize her organization had sent her to acquire. She explained quickly that the facility was rigged to self-destruct, that Sadler had implemented fail-safes that would detonate if he died, and that Leon and Ashley had minutes to escape before the entire island was consumed in fire. She provided them with a route to the dock where a jet ski waited, then disappeared. Again on her own extraction route, Leon and Ashley ran through the collapsing facility, staying ahead of explosions and collapsing structures, fighting through the few remaining ganados who hadn't evacuated or realized their leader was dead. They reached the dock as the primary laboratory exploded behind them, sending flames shooting hundreds of feet into the air. Leon and Ashley escaped on the jet ski as the island burned, putting distance between themselves and the facility as secondary explosions tore through Los Illuminados infrastructure. Behind them, the cult's primary base consumed itself in a pyre that could probably be seen from the mainland, smoke rising into the dawn sky like a funeral marker for everyone who had died in Sadler's schemes. They reached the far shore as the sun rose, exhausted and traumatized, but alive and free of infection. Hunnigan confirmed extraction teams were en route, that they would be taken to a secure location for medical evaluation and debriefing. Ashley asked Leon if it was really over, if Los Illuminados was truly finished. Leon didn't have a certain answer. Sadler was dead, the primary facility destroyed, the leadership killed. But Las Plagas still existed in the village and surrounding areas. Infected ganados still wandered the region. The samples and research couldn't all have been destroyed. Los Illuminados as an organization might be broken, but the threat they represented, the threat of parasitic infection and mind control, would persist in some form. For now, though, it was over for them. Ashley was safe, Leon had completed his mission, and they had both survived an ordeal that had claimed dozens of lives. They waited on that shore for extraction, watching the smoke rise from the burning island, knowing that the nightmares from this mission would haunt them for years, but grateful to have the luxury of nightmares rather than the alternative. The shadows behind while Leon and Ashley recovered from their extraction, receiving medical treatment and undergoing decontamination procedures to ensure no plaga material remained in their systems. Other forces moved to secure what remained of Los Illuminados research. Ada Wong delivered her sample, to the organization that had hired her, a group whose identity remained classified but whose interests in bioweapons technology were clearly significant. The United States military deployed teams to the Spanish region to contain the Plaga outbreak and secure any research that could be recovered. They found the village largely abandoned, the Ganados having dispersed into the surrounding countryside, or died when Sadler's control was severed. The castle was ruined, structurally unsound, and picked through by scavengers. The island facility was destroyed beyond recovery, the self-destruct having been thorough. But samples remained. Documents survived in bunkers and backup facilities. The knowledge of how to cultivate and control Las Plagas hadn't been completely destroyed. The military collected what they could, classified it at the highest levels, and began their own research into how the parasites might be weaponized or countered. The threat Los Illuminados represented hadn't been eliminated, merely dispersed and transformed into a different category of danger. Ramon Salazar's family estate was seized by Spanish authorities, who found extensive documentation of the cult's activities hidden in the castle's undamaged wings. The eighth Castellan's betrayal of his family's legacy became a matter of public record, a cautionary tale about manipulation and fanaticism. The Salazar family line ended with Ramon, his choices ensuring there would be no ninth count to inherit the title. Jack Krauser was officially confirmed dead, his body recovered from the island facility and identified through dental records since his Plaga transformation had damaged his features beyond visual recognition. His service record was amended to note his death in action rather than the helicopter accident that had been previously recorded. Though the details of his betrayal and work with Los Illuminados remained classified. The military conducted internal investigations into how one of their elite operatives had been turned, what failures in oversight had allowed his recruitment by a terrorist organization, and what could be done to prevent similar incidents in the future. Luis Serra's contributions to both creating and attempting to cure Las Plagas were documented in after-action reports, though his role remained controversial. Some viewed him as a hero who had sacrificed himself to help Leon and Ashley escape. Others saw him as complicit in the deaths of everyone Los Illuminados had infected. His late attempts at redemption insufficient to balance his earlier participation in the cult's research. His body was never recovered from the castle laboratory, presumed consumed in the structure's collapse. The Spanish government conducted extensive cleanup operations in the affected region, quarantining villages and evacuating anyone who might have been exposed to Plaga's infection. The official explanation released to the public referenced a chemical spill that had caused neurological damage to the local population, requiring evacuation and long-term treatment. The truth about parasitic infection and cult activity remained classified, deemed too dangerous for public knowledge. Leon Kennedy returned to active duty after several weeks of recovery and psychological evaluation. The mission had changed him in ways that were difficult to quantify. He had entered Spain as a competent agent still haunted by Raccoon City. He left as someone who had faced an entirely different category of bioterror threat and survived through a combination of skill, determination, and luck that he knew wouldn't always be sufficient. The nightmares from Raccoon City were joined by new ones featuring parasites and the faces of people he hadn't been able to save. Ashley Graham returned to her life under heavy security, the experience having transformed her from a college student concerned primarily with grades and social life into someone who understood firsthand how fragile safety could be. She underwent extensive therapy to process the trauma of kidnapping and infection, the knowledge that something had been growing inside her, controlling her, preparing to use her as a weapon against her own country. Her relationship with her father became complicated. Gratitude for sending Leon to rescue her mixed with resentment at being a target in the first place because of who she was. She corresponded with Leon occasionally in the months following their extraction, emails that started as checking in on each other's recovery and evolved into something between friendship and shared trauma bond. They were two of only a handful of people who truly understood what had happened in Spain, what Los Illuminados had been attempting, and how close the cult had come to succeeding. That shared understanding created connection that neither of them had with anyone else in their lives. Ada Wong disappeared after delivering her sample, returning to whatever shadow organization employed her. Intelligence agencies across multiple countries attempted to track her movements, but she remained as elusive as always, appearing and disappearing from situations without leaving traces beyond her impact on events. Her role in helping Leon and Ashley escape suggested she maintained some personal code beyond simple mercenary interests, but her ultimate loyalties remained unclear. The Las Plagas sample she had delivered began its own journey through the black market of bioweapons research. Her employers, whoever they were, apparently sold or lost control of the sample, and it proliferated through networks of terrorist organizations and rogue states looking for the next weapon that might shift global power balances. The parasite that Sadler had excavated from beneath a Spanish village would eventually appear in conflicts across the world, each new outbreak requiring response and containment and adding to the growing catalog of bioterror threats that organizations like the BSAA would be formed to combat. Osmond Sadler's background was investigated thoroughly in the aftermath, intelligence agencies attempting to understand how he had built Los Illuminados and what his ultimate goals had been. They found that he had been a charismatic preacher who had drifted through various religious movements before settling in rural Spain, where he had ingratiated himself with the local population through charity and promises of spiritual fulfillment. His discovery of references to Las Plagas in old Salazar family documents had transformed him from wandering preacher to cult leader with apocalyptic vision. His plan to infiltrate the U.S. government through Ashley had been only one component of a larger strategy. Documents recovered from Los Illuminados facilities revealed negotiations with multiple hostile nations and terrorist organizations, all interested in acquiring Plaga samples for their own purposes. Sadler had been building a network that would have allowed him to influence global politics through the threat of infection, positioning Los Illuminados as kingmakers who could topple governments or protect them depending on who paid tribute to the cult's power. The plan had required patience and careful execution across years of development. Sadler had spent nearly a decade building Los Illuminados, converting the local population, developing Plagas cultivation methods, and establishing the infrastructure that would allow the cult to operate as both religious movement and bioweapons developer. His recruitment of Krauser had been a coup that provided military expertise and access to intelligence about potential targets. His manipulation of Salazar had given him resources and legitimacy within the region. But the plan had failed because Sadler had underestimated Leon Kennedy. The cult leader had viewed Leon as simply another government agent, skilled perhaps, but ultimately predictable and controllable. He had failed to account for Leon's experience in Raccoon City, his ability to adapt to situations that would break most people, and his absolute refusal to abandon Ashley regardless of how impossible the mission became. That miscalculation had cost Sadler everything. The village where Leon's mission had begun was eventually demolished, the Spanish government determining that the buildings were too contaminated with plaga material to be safely preserved. The land was quarantined indefinitely, signs posted warning about environmental hazards, though the truth about what had occurred there remained classified. Locals who had fled the infection were resettled in other regions given compensation and stern warnings about signing non disclosure agreements regarding anything they had witnessed. The lake where Leon had fought Del Lago was dredged, the creature's remains recovered, and transported to secure facilities for study. Marine biologists and parasitology experts examined the salamander's transformed body, attempting to understand how Las Plagas had caused such dramatic growth and mutation. Their findings contributed to growing understanding of the parasite's effects on host biology, but also raised disturbing questions about what other creatures might have been infected in the region and what might still be living in areas that hadn't been thoroughly cleared. The castle ruins became a minor tourist attraction, ironically, with the Spanish government eventually allowing limited access to the outer walls and courtyard while keeping the interior sealed for safety reasons. Tours guides told sanitized stories about the Salazar family's history and the castle's architectural significance, never mentioning the cult that had operated there or the horrors that had occurred in its final days. Occasionally, urban explorers would attempt to penetrate deeper into the ruins, and occasionally bodies would be found of people who had encountered plaga organisms that had survived in the castle's depths. The island facility remained off limits, the destruction too complete and the contamination too severe for any salvage operations. It became a navigation hazard, marked on maps with warnings to avoid the area. Fishermen reported strange sightings near the island occasionally, suggestions that some of Los Illuminados' bioweapons experiments had escaped into the surrounding waters. The Spanish Navy conducted periodic patrols to ensure no one attempted to land on the island, though what they would do if they found surviving plaga organisms remained unclear. In classified briefings, intelligence officials attempted to assess how many plaga samples remained at large and what the long-term threat level was. The estimates were troubling. Los Illuminados had been selling samples for years before the organization's collapse. Sadler had sent infected agents to other countries as part of sleeper programs. The cult had maintained research facilities beyond the primary island laboratory, some of which had never been located. The complete eradication of Las Plagas appeared impossible, meaning the threat would persist in various forms for the foreseeable future. The BSAA, the Bioterrorism Security Assessment Alliance, was formed partially in response to the Las Plagas incident. The organization's mandate was to respond to bioterror threats globally, providing rapid deployment capability and expertise that individual nations might lack. Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine, veterans of the Raccoon City incident and Umbrella's collapse, became founding members of the BSAA, their experience with bioweapons making them invaluable to the organization's mission. Leon himself was approached about joining the BSA, but he declined. His role as a government agent provided different capabilities and access, and he preferred working within established intelligence frameworks rather than the quasi-military structure the BSAA represented. He did, however, cooperate extensively with BSAA operations, providing intelligence and occasionally participating in joint missions when his expertise was specifically needed. The psychological impact of the Spain mission on Leon was profound and lasting. He had entered the mission knowing it would be dangerous, prepared for combat and crisis, but not prepared for the specific horror of parasitic infection and the knowledge that his own body was being transformed into a weapon against his will. The treatment that had destroyed the plaga inside him had been agonizing, and the memory of that pain remained vivid years later. He found himself checking constantly for signs of infection, even though medical scans confirmed he was clear. He would wake from nightmares where the whispers in Spanish returned, where he felt the plaga moving inside him again, where he looked in mirrors and saw his eyes glazed with the parasite's control. Therapy helped to some degree, but the fundamental trauma of having been infected, of having lost autonomy over his own body, wasn't something that could be completely resolved through talking about it. His relationship with trust became even more complicated after Krauser's betrayal. Leon had believed his former mentor was dead, had mourned him as a fallen comrade, and then discovered that not only was Krauser alive, but had actively joined the enemy and orchestrated Ashley's kidnapping. That betrayal cut deeper than the physical wounds from their final battle. It made Leon question his judgment about people, made him wonder what signs he had missed that might have predicted Krauser's turn. Ada Wong remained an enigma that Leon couldn't resolve. She had helped him in Spain just as she had helped him in Raccoon City, but her ultimate loyalties remained with organizations and interests that Leon didn't understand and couldn't trust. He wanted to believe that some part of her genuinely cared about him, that her assistance came from more than simple convenience or alignment of interests. But he also recognized that wanting to believe something didn't make it true, and that Ada had chosen her path just as surely as he had chosen his. The mission had also reinforced Leon's understanding of the bioterror threat's true scope. Raccoon City had been presented as an isolated incident, Umbrella's crimes as the actions of a single corrupt corporation, but Los Illuminados had demonstrated that bioweapons development was far more widespread than public knowledge suggested. The cult had operated independently of Umbrella, had developed its own parasitic bioweapon, and had come terrifyingly close to using that weapon to infiltrate the highest levels of government. If one cult in rural Spain could achieve that much, how many other groups were working on similar projects in other parts of the world? Ashley Graham's recovery followed a different trajectory. Unlike Leon, she hadn't chosen this life. She had been a target simply because of who her father was, kidnapped and infected as part of a scheme she couldn't have predicted or prevented. Her trauma included not just the physical experience of infection, but the violation of being used as a weapon, the knowledge that Sadler had planned to send her back to her family and country as a puppet that would destroy everything she loved. She struggled with guilt over Luis's death, knowing intellectually that his sacrifice had been his choice, but feeling responsible nonetheless. She had nightmares about the church where Sadler had first explained what would happen to her, about the laboratory where the infection had nearly reached completion, about the radiation chamber where the plaga had been destroyed inside her. The medical aftermath had included extensive testing to ensure no plaga material remained, procedures that were necessary but invasive and which reinforced the sense that her body had been compromised, contaminated, made into something dangerous. Her security detail after Spain was extensive and permanent. Secret Service agents accompanied her everywhere, and her movements were tracked and limited in ways that made normal college life impossible. She eventually took a leave of absence from school, the combination of trauma and security requirements making it impractical to continue her education in a traditional setting. She completed her degree through alternative arrangements, but the experience of being a normal student was lost to her. She maintained correspondence with Leon partly because he was one of the few people who understood what she had experienced without needing explanation. To most people, including her family and therapists, what had happened in Spain was abstract, a story they heard but couldn't truly comprehend. Leon had been there. He had been infected alongside her, had fought through the same horrors, had endured the same treatment. When she wrote to him about nightmares, or anxiety or the feeling that something was still wrong inside her, he understood in ways that others couldn't. Their correspondence remained carefully professional, both of them aware that anything more personal would be complicated by their circumstances and the power imbalances inherent in their situation. But within those professional boundaries, they developed genuine care for each other's well being, checking in during difficult times, celebrating small victories in recovery, acknowledging the anniversaries of the mission's conclusion with messages that said simply that they remembered and were thinking of each other. Leon occasionally wondered what his life might have looked like if he had never driven into Raccoon City that night in 1998, if he had heeded the warning and stayed away, if he had chosen a different career path after the outbreak. He might have been an ordinary police officer in an ordinary city, dealing with ordinary crimes, living an ordinary life. Instead, he had become a specialist in bioterror threats, someone who was called in when situations involved parasites and viruses and creatures that shouldn't exist. He couldn't honestly say he regretted his path. The work was necessary. People like Ashley needed agents like him to extract them from situations that conventional military or law enforcement couldn't handle. The bioterror threats weren't going to disappear simply because they were terrifying and difficult to combat. Someone had to stand against them, and Leon had the experience and skills to be effective in that role. But he also recognized the cost, the relationships he couldn't maintain because of his work's secrecy and danger, the normalcy he had sacrificed, the parts of himself that had been damaged in ways that couldn't be repaired. The Spain mission became a classified case study used in training for special operations forces and intelligence agents. Obviously, details that could identify individuals or locations were redacted, but the essential facts were preserved as lessons about cult infiltration, bioweapon threats, and solo operative survival in hostile territory. Leon's tactical decisions were analyzed, his successes and mistakes cataloged, his adaptations to unexpected situations documented as examples of effective field work. Some agents who studied the case expressed skepticism that a single operative could have accomplished what Leon had, suggesting that the reports must be exaggerated or that Leon had received support that wasn't documented. Those who knew Leon personally assured the skeptics that, if anything, the official reports understated how dire the situation had been and how improbable Leon's success was. He had operated for days in territory where literally everyone except a few scattered allies had been infected and hostile, had survived multiple encounters with enhanced bioweapons, and had completed his mission while himself being infected with the same parasite that controlled his enemies. The fact that he had succeeded at all was remarkable. The geopolitical implications of the Las Plagas incident continued to develop in the years following Spain. Nations that had purchased samples from Los Illuminados found themselves dealing with outbreaks when the parasites proved harder to control than Sadler had promised. Terrorist organizations that had acquired plagas discovered that using the parasites as weapons was complicated by the organism's tendency to spread beyond intended targets, and by the dramatic physical changes that made infected individuals obvious rather than subtle infiltrators. Some nations attempted to develop their own plagas variants, using the samples they had acquired as foundation for research programs aimed at creating controllable bioweapons. These programs generally ended badly, with outbreaks that required containment operations and international intervention. The BSA responded to multiple plagas-related incidents in the years after Spain, each one requiring tactics and resources that were refined through painful experience. The The parasite's ability to retain host intelligence while subverting will made them particularly dangerous compared to simpler bioweapons like viruses that merely killed or created mindless zombies. An army of ganados could use weapons, follow complex orders, and maintain operational security in ways that zombies never could. This made Plague's infections exponentially more dangerous from a military perspective and exponentially harder to detect and contain before they reached critical mass. Research into countermeasures against Las Plagas became a priority for nations and organizations concerned with bioterror defense. The radiation treatment that had saved Leon and Ashley worked, but required specialized equipment and caused significant trauma to patients. Scientists worked on developing pharmaceutical interventions that could destroy Plaga's organisms less invasively, with limited success. The parasites proved remarkably resistant to conventional antiparasitics, and the integration with the host's nervous system made targeted destruction difficult without causing severe neurological damage. Some researchers explored the possibility of developing immunity to Plagas infection, attempting to create vaccines that would prevent the parasites from successfully establishing themselves in potential hosts. This work was complicated by the Plaga's variability and by ethical considerations around human testing of vaccines for parasites that were themselves classified and whose existence wasn't publicly acknowledged. Progress was slow and often set back by outbreaks that consumed resources and personnel. The village where Leon's mission began eventually became something of a ghost story in Spanish folklore. Locals who lived in surrounding regions told stories about the abandoned settlement where something terrible had happened, where the government had evacuated everyone in the middle of the night and never allowed them to return. The stories grew in the telling, becoming tales of curses and monsters, versions of truth that were sometimes closer to accuracy than the tellers realized. Occasionally, someone would attempt to enter the quarantine zone, drawn by curiosity or the thrill of exploring forbidden places. Most were turned back by patrols before reaching the village itself. Those who did make it through sometimes returned with strange stories of ruins that seemed to watch them, of sounds in the empty buildings, of the feeling that they were being followed by things they couldn't quite see. Some never returned at all, their disappearances attributed to accidents or to getting lost in the difficult terrain, though there were always suspicions that something else had claimed them. The church where Leon had first encountered Sadler remained standing, its structure more durable than the surrounding buildings. It became a particular focus of the strange stories, tales of lights seen in its windows at night, of chanting heard by people kilometers away, of the sensation that something was still being worshipped there even though the village had been abandoned for years. Scientific teams that investigated found no evidence of ongoing Plagas activity, but they also couldn't completely dismiss the reports. Parasites were remarkably resilient, and it was possible that some organisms had survived in dormant states, waiting for new hosts. Ramon Salazar's family history was studied extensively by historians fascinated by how the family's legacy had culminated in the Eighth Castellan's catastrophic decisions. The Salazars had been minor nobility who had gained prominence during Spain's colonial period, accumulating wealth and influence that they had maintained for generations. Their decision to seal Las Plagas in the first place had been driven by horror at what the parasites could do at villages consumed by infection during the original outbreak centuries ago. For generations, the Salazar family had guarded the seal, passing down warnings about the dangers of excavation in the mountains, maintaining traditions and restrictions that were meant to prevent anyone from accidentally releasing the parasites. Ramon's decision to break the seal and release Las Plagas represented the complete inversion of everything his family had stood for, a betrayal that destroyed not just his own life, but the legacy of everyone who had come before him. Psychologists who studied Ramon's case posthumously suggested that his physical condition and social isolation had made him vulnerable to Sadler's manipulation, as someone whose body had marked him as different and who had struggled with the weight of family expectations. Ramon had been susceptible to promises of purpose and transcendence. Sadler had offered him significance beyond his role as guardian of a seal, had reframed the Plagas as holy rather than dangerous, and had convinced Ramon that releasing them would make him a savior rather than a failure. The castle that had been the Salazar family seat for centuries eventually became the subject of restoration efforts, though these were limited to stabilizing the structure rather than rebuilding it. The Spanish government determined that the castle had historical significance that justified preservation even given what had occurred there. The interior remained closed to the public, but the exterior walls and courtyard were maintained as examples of regional architecture from the colonial period. Jack Krauser's betrayal led to extensive reviews of military psychological evaluation procedures and operative oversight protocols. The fact that a decorated Special Forces soldier had been turned by a bioterror cult without anyone detecting warning signs was seen as a massive failure of institutional safeguards. New procedures were implemented requiring more frequent evaluations, better monitoring of operatives who had been exposed to bioweapon threats, and more robust systems for detecting behavioral changes that might indicate compromise. Some of Krauser's former colleagues defended his memory, arguing that his turn had been driven by legitimate grievances about how the military had handled Operation Javier and abandoned his team. They suggested that the real failure was institutional, that if the military had better supported operatives in the field and been more honest about bioweapon threats, Krauser might never have felt betrayed enough to seek power elsewhere. These arguments were generally dismissed by official reviews, but they resonated with some operatives who had experienced similar abandonment and recognized that the line between loyalty and betrayal could be thinner than institutions wanted to acknowledge. Operation Javier itself became the subject of renewed investigation in the aftermath of Krauser's revealed survival and betrayal. The original mission reports were reviewed for anything that might have predicted his turn, any signs of compromise or ideological shift that had been missed. Investigators found that the mission had been even more traumatic than initially documented, that the bioweapons Krauser and Leon had encountered had been far more dangerous than official reports suggested, and that both operatives had been left in situations where they had been expected to handle threats that should have required military support. Leon's own reports from Operation Javier were examined closely, looking for his perspective on Krauser's behavior and performance during the mission. Leon's accounts painted a picture of an operative who had been increasingly frustrated with command decisions and who had begun to question whether the government he served actually valued the people it sent into danger. But there had been nothing in Leon's observations that predicted Krauser would fake his own death and join a bioterror cult. The betrayal had been as shocking to Leon as to anyone. The question of how many other operatives might be compromised by similar circumstances haunted intelligence agencies. If Krauser could be turned, who else might be vulnerable? What other veterans of bioweapon incidents might be nursing grievances that could be exploited by hostile organizations? The answer appeared to be that any operative who had been deeply traumatized and felt abandoned by their government was potentially vulnerable, which described a concerning percentage of people who worked in bioterror response. Luis Serra's role in the incident remained controversial and somewhat mysterious, even after extensive investigation. His background was confirmed. He had been a researcher with Umbrella Corporation's European division before that organization's collapse, had been recruited by Los Illuminados specifically for his expertise in bioweapon development, and had helped Sadler develop methods for cultivating and controlling Las Plagas. His claimed crisis of conscience and attempts to help Leon and Ashley appeared to be genuine based on his actions, but questions remained about what had motivated his change of heart and whether he had done enough to atone for his role in creating the threat. Some viewed Luis as a tragic figure who had made terrible choices but tried to make amends, in the end, sacrificing himself to help others escape the situation his research had enabled. Others saw him as a war criminal whose late attempts at redemption couldn't balance the deaths his work had caused, the villages infected, the people transformed into ganados. The truth was probably somewhere between these extremes, a complicated person who had made progressively worse choices until he finally recognized how far he had fallen and tried desperately to climb back toward redemption. His research notes, recovered from various Los Illuminados facilities, demonstrated genuine brilliance in parasitology and bioweapon development. Under different circumstances with different ethical constraints, Luis might have made legitimate contributions to science. Instead, his talents had been turned toward developing methods to make parasitic infection more efficient and control mechanisms more robust. The notes also revealed his growing horror as he came to understand what Sadler truly intended. Annotations questioning the morality of their work, sketches of potential countermeasures suggesting he had been developing treatments, even while officially continuing to help Los Illuminados. Ada Wong's employers remained unidentified despite extensive intelligence efforts to determine who she had been working for during the Spain incident. Multiple agencies investigated, attempting to trace the plaga sample she had extracted and determine what organization had hired her. The trail went cold quickly, suggesting either that her employers had sophisticated operational security or that they had sufficient influence to make certain records disappear. Theories ranged from rival corporations seeking to develop bioweapons to nations building biological warfare programs to shadow organizations whose interests and loyalties transcended conventional geopolitics. What was known was that Ada had completed her mission successfully, acquiring a dominant plaga sample directly from Sadler's body. That sample represented the most valuable possible acquisition from Los Illuminados' research, a parasite variant that granted enhancement without sacrificing host control. Any organization that possessed it would have the foundation for developing controllable bioweapon soldiers, exactly the kind of capability that would shift strategic balances and enable operations that conventional military forces couldn't accomplish. The sample's subsequent proliferation suggested that Ada's employers had either sold it or lost control of it, allowing it to spread through black market networks where it was acquired by multiple hostile actors. This pattern was consistent with previous bioweapon incidents where valuable samples had been bought and sold repeatedly, each transaction spreading the threat further and making containment progressively more difficult. By the time international law enforcement and intelligence agencies became aware of a bioweapons proliferation, it was usually too late to prevent it from being used. Leon occasionally thought about Ada during quiet moments, wondered where she was and what she was doing, whether she ever reflected on the people she had helped, and whether those actions meant anything beyond tactical convenience. He knew he should simply categorize her as an enemy asset, someone whose assistance during crises didn't change the fact that her ultimate loyalties were hostile to his interest. But human emotions weren't that simple, and the connection they had developed across multiple bioweapon incidents persisted despite all the rational reasons to dismiss it, the umbrella. Corporation's final collapse was accelerated by information gathered during the Spain incident investigation. Documents found in Los Illuminados facilities revealed connections between Luis's previous work for Umbrella and his recruitment by Sadler, suggesting information sharing between the organizations. This evidence was used in ongoing legal proceedings against Umbrella's remaining executives and subsidiaries, contributing to judgments that finally dismantled what was left of the corporation's infrastructure. By 2005, Umbrella existed only as a cautionary tale and as scattered assets being absorbed by successor organizations. But the bioweapon technology Umbrella had developed continued to proliferate, kept alive by former researchers, stolen samples, and black market networks that saw enormous profit potential in weapons that conventional, international law struggled to address. Las Plagas was simply the latest addition to a growing catalog of biological threats that included the T virus, G virus, and various derivative organisms. Each new bioweapon incident added to that catalog, and each incident's containment created samples and documentation that eventually found their way to other organizations ready to continue the cycle. The fundamental problem, as analysts recognized, was that bioweapon development required relatively modest resources compared to conventional weapons programs. A small team of researchers in a hidden laboratory could develop organisms capable of threatening entire cities. The knowledge required was increasingly accessible as former bioweapon researchers sought employment and as research was published or stolen. Preventing bioweapon proliferation entirely appeared impossible. The best that could be achieved was rapid response to outbreaks and aggressive pursuit of organizations that developed or sold bioweapons. This reality shaped the post-Spain world that Leon inhabited. His work became a series of responses to threats that couldn't be permanently eliminated, missions that succeeded by containing immediate dangers while knowing that the underlying capability to create those dangers persisted. It was exhausting and often felt futile, like trying to empty an ocean with a bucket. But the alternative was surrender, allowing bioweapon threats to spread unchecked, and that wasn't something Leon could accept. Years after Spain, Leon would sometimes revisit his memories of the mission, examining his decisions and wondering what he might have done differently. Should he have tried harder to save Luis, found a way to get him medical treatment before his wounds became fatal? Could he have predicted Krauser's betrayal if he had paid more attention during Operation Javier? Should he have done more to secure Los Illuminados research before the island facility self-destructed, ensuring that Las Plagas couldn't proliferate further? The answers were usually that he had done the best possible under impossible circumstances, that expecting perfection from himself wasn't reasonable, that survival and mission success were victory enough. But doubt persisted. The suspicion that someone better or smarter or luckier might have achieved more, might have prevented some of the subsequent Plagas incidents, might have saved the people who died because samples had escaped into the world. Ashley Graham eventually returned to public life in a limited capacity, accepting that normal privacy was impossible, but working to create a meaningful existence within those constraints. She became involved in advocacy work related to bioterrorism threats, using her experience to push for better international cooperation and response capabilities. Her speeches on the subject were powerful, carrying the weight of someone who had survived what others only feared theoretically. She didn't discuss details of her kidnapping and infection, but she spoke eloquently about the reality of bioterror threats and the importance of supporting people who responded to them. Her advocacy brought her back into contact with Leon occasionally, both attending conferences or meetings where bioterror policy was discussed. These encounters were always cordial and slightly awkward, the weight of their shared experience creating connection that neither knew quite how to navigate in professional settings. They would exchange pleasantries, ask about each other's well being, and carefully avoid discussing Spain in any depth. The understanding between them didn't require words. They both knew what the other had survived and what shadows they still carried. The survivors of Los Illuminados infection who had been cured during cleanup operations faced their own long recoveries. These were primarily people who had been infected shortly before Sadler's death, whose plagas hadn't reached full maturity and who could still be treated. They returned to their lives with fragmented memories of their time under the parasite's control, knowing they had done things while infected, but not fully remembering what or why. The psychological burden of having been puppeted, of having lost autonomy and been made weapons against their will, echoed Ashley's trauma in different contexts. Support groups were eventually created for Plaga survivors, though the classified nature of the infection meant these groups were small and tightly controlled. Participants shared experiences of losing time, of half remembering actions they hadn't chosen to take, of the horror of knowing something had been living inside them and controlling them. They also shared strategies for managing the aftermath, for processing trauma that most therapists had no framework to understand, for living with the knowledge that they had been infected and might be vulnerable to future infections if they were ever exposed again. The question of whether infection created permanent vulnerability was debated by researchers. Some evidence suggested that the body developed antibodies after Plaga's treatment that might offer partial protection against reinfection. Other evidence suggested that once a host's nervous system had been compromised by a parasite, subsequent infections established themselves more easily. The uncertainty added to survivors' anxiety, the knowledge that they might be either slightly more protected or significantly more vulnerable than they had been before infection. Leon tested positive for Plagas antibodies in routine medical screenings after Spain, confirming his body retained immunological memory of the infection. Whether this provided meaningful protection remained unclear, but it marked him as someone who had been infected and treated successfully, part of a relatively small population that bioweapon researchers had significant interest in studying. He cooperated with medical research to a degree, understanding that data from survivors might help develop better treatments, but resisted attempts to study him more invasively than he felt comfortable with. The long-term health effects of Plagas infection and treatment were still being documented years after Spain. Some survivors reported persistent neurological symptoms, phantom sensations that echoed the parasite's presence, occasional auditory hallucinations of the whispers that had accompanied the infection. These symptoms generally faded with time but rarely disappeared completely, suggesting the parasites had caused subtle permanent changes to nervous system function even after being destroyed. Ashley experienced these symptoms occasionally, moments where she would hear Spanish whispers that she knew weren't real or feel sensations that mimicked the parasite's movement inside her body. Medical scans always showed she was clean, the plagas completely destroyed, but subjective experience didn't always align with objective measurement. She learned to manage the symptoms through therapy and medication, accepting them as scars from her ordeal that she would carry permanently. Leon's symptoms were similar, but manifested differently, perhaps because of his training and experience. He would sometimes slip into hypervigilance that echoed the constant threat assessment he had maintained while infected, and knowing his body could betray him at any moment, he would check his environment compulsively, looking for threats that weren't there, responding to stimuli with reactions calibrated for combat situations rather than daily life. These responses were manageable, but never entirely left him, part of how Spain had permanently changed his relationship with his own body and surroundings. The village that Leon had first fought through was eventually demolished entirely, every building destroyed, and the rubble buried under layers of soil and concrete. The Spanish government determined that even with quarantine, the risk of remaining Plaga's organisms was too great to leave structures standing where they might shelter dormant parasites. The demolition took months and required extensive precautions. Workers in sealed environmental suits carefully dismantling buildings while researchers monitored for any signs of active infection. During demolition, workers found additional evidence of Los Illuminados' operations, hidden chambers where the cult had stored supplies and conducted rituals, mass graves where failed experiments or resistant villagers had been disposed of, shrines decorated with occult symbols and dried blood. The scope of what Sadler had built in the region exceeded what initial investigations had uncovered, suggesting the cult had been active longer and had infected more people than official estimates had indicated. The castle was partially demolished as well, interior structures considered too dangerous to preserve. The outer walls remained as historical landmarks, but everything inside them was destroyed and removed. The laboratory where Luis had died was sealed with concrete after materials were salvaged, buried under tons of fill designed to prevent access. Future archaeologists, if they ever excavated the site, would find layers of rubble and concrete marking the castle's final chapter, physical record of how Ramon Salazar's legacy had ended in catastrophic failure. The island facility wasn't demolished because the self-destruct had been thorough enough that little remained to demolish. Periodic surveys confirmed the site was structurally unstable and environmentally contaminated, unsuitable for any future use. It remained on navigation charts as a hazard to be avoided, gradually eroding as weather and waves worked on the damaged structures. Eventually, it would collapse entirely into the sea, any remaining Plaga samples presumably destroyed by salt water and time. But samples had already escaped, carried off by Ada and presumably by others during the chaos of Los Illuminados' collapse. Those samples continued their journey through black markets and shadow organizations, appearing in incidents across the world over the following years. Each incident required response, containment, cleanup. Each incident added more survivors to the population of people marked by Plagas infection, and each incident confirmed that what Leon and Ashley had survived in Spain wasn't an isolated event, but the beginning of a new phase in bioweapon proliferation. The BSAA tracked Plaga's incidents globally, maintaining databases of outbreaks and responses that grew steadily over time. Africa, the Middle East, Eastern Europe, South America, parasites appeared in conflict zones and failed states where oversight was weak and where hostile organizations could operate with relative freedom. The BSA responded when possible, often arriving too late to prevent casualties, but in time to prevent complete catastrophe. Chris Redfield, leading many of these responses, developed grudging respect for what Leon had accomplished in Spain. Operating alone in hostile territory, while infected himself, Leon had not only survived, but had successfully rescued Ashley and eliminated Los Illuminados' leadership. Chris's own operations typically involved teams with extensive support, and even then they often face situations that push capabilities to breaking points. What Leon had managed solo seemed nearly impossible, yet the evidence confirmed it had happened. The two men met occasionally at interagency briefings, representatives of different organizations responding to bioterror threats. They developed professional respect despite different operational styles, Chris favoring direct military action while Leon preferred intelligence and infiltration approaches. Both recognized that the threat required multiple response types, that no single organization or methodology could address all bioweapon incidents effectively. Jill Valentine, Chris's longtime partner in BSAA operations, was particularly interested in plagueis biology and how it differed from the viruses they had fought during the Umbrella era. The parasite's ability to retain host intelligence while overriding will represented a qualitatively different threat than zombification. It meant infected populations could maintain infrastructure, use complex tools, coordinate strategically, all while being controlled by hostile forces. From a containment perspective, this made plagueis infections exponentially harder to identify and isolate before they reached critical mass. Research into detection methods became a priority. Scientists working to develop tests that could identify plagueis infection before the parasites reached maturity and the host lost free will. Blood tests, neurological scans, behavioral assessment protocols, all were attempted with varying success. The most reliable method remained physical examination looking for the characteristic lump at the back of the neck, where parasites typically established themselves, but this required close access to potential hosts and wasn't practical for mass screening. The geopolitical implications of undetectable mind control continued to generate anxiety in intelligence communities. If plagueis infections couldn't be reliably detected before maturity, then any population could potentially be infiltrated without outside observers recognizing the compromise. The scenario Sadler had planned with Ashley, sending infected individuals into positions of power where they could influence policy, remained a viable threat vector that defensive intelligence agencies struggled to counter. Some nations implemented security protocols requiring regular neurological screening for government officials and military personnel, attempting to catch infections before they reached critical stages. These protocols were expensive and created their own security concerns, as the screening process required access to classified information about bioweapons that many personnel weren't cleared for. Balancing security against operational efficiency remained an ongoing challenge. Leon's role evolved as the bioterror threat landscape changed. He took on more training responsibilities, sharing his experience with newer agents who hadn't lived through Raccoon City or Spain. He found teaching difficult initially, struggling to articulate lessons that he had learned through trauma and desperate improvisation. But over time, he developed methods for conveying critical skills and mindsets, helping agents understand that surviving bioweapon incidents required mental flexibility as much as tactical training. He emphasized adaptability in his training, the importance of operating without complete information, and making decisions despite uncertainty. Many agents came from military backgrounds where clear chains of command and defined missions were normal. Bioweapon incidents rarely provided that clarity. Agents needed to function when command structure collapsed, when intelligence was wrong, when situations evolved faster than support could respond. Leon's experience provided case studies in exactly that kind of survival. Ashley Graham continued her advocacy work, becoming increasingly prominent in international bioterror policy discussions. Her status as the president's daughter gave her access to forums that others in the advocacy space couldn't reach, and her first-hand experience gave her credibility that policy analysts lacked. She pushed consistently for better international cooperation, arguing that bioterror threats transcended national boundaries and required coordinated response frameworks that didn't exist yet. Her advocacy brought her into occasional conflict with security agencies that preferred keeping bioweapon information classified. Ashley argued that public awareness was necessary for political will to support response capabilities, that people couldn't support policies addressing threats they didn't know existed. The agencies argued that publicizing bioweapon capabilities provided blueprints for terrorists and encouraged proliferation. The tension between transparency and security remained unresolved. Years after Spain, a journalist investigating classified government programs pieced together enough information about Los Illuminados to publish a story that came close to revealing the truth about the incident. The article described a cult in rural Spain that had developed parasitic bioweapons and kidnapped an American official's daughter, requiring a covert rescue operation that ended with the cult's destruction. Many details were wrong or missing, but the core narrative was accurate enough that intelligence agencies panicked about what else the journalist might have learned. The government pressured the journalist's publication to spike the story, arguing that national security required continued classification. The publication complied reluctantly, but the story leaked online anyway, spreading through conspiracy theory networks and investigative journalism forums. Most people dismissed it as speculative fiction, too outlandish to be credible, but some recognized elements of truth, and the story contributed to growing public awareness that bioweapon threats were more widespread than official sources acknowledged. Ashley was approached by journalists multiple times, seeking confirmation or details about what had happened. She declined all requests for interviews, maintaining the government's position that details remained classified for security reasons. Privately, she struggled with the decision, knowing that her silence enabled continued secrecy around threats that the public deserved to understand. But she also recognized that her father's position and her own security required cooperation with classification requirements, that speaking publicly would create diplomatic incidents and security problems she couldn't responsibly cause. Leon faced similar requests and responded with the same professional silence. His career depended on maintaining classification, and his understanding of operational security made him deeply uncomfortable with the idea of discussing missions publicly. But he also recognized the frustration of living with experiences that couldn't be shared, carrying memories of events that officially never happened, knowing truths that most people couldn't access. The conspiracy theories that grew around the Spain incident were sometimes unintentionally accurate, other times completely wrong in entertaining ways. Some theorists correctly identified that a parasitic bioweapon had been involved, that a cult had operated in rural Spain, that American special operations had conducted an extraction. Others spun elaborate fiction about alien involvement or supernatural forces, creating narratives that bore no resemblance to actual events. Leon found some of the theories darkly amusing. The idea that people could imagine zombies and aliens more easily than they could accept the reality of parasites and cults. The village site remained quarantined indefinitely, though enforcement of the quarantine degraded over time as resources were allocated elsewhere. Occasional trespassers still attempted to explore the area, drawn by the mystery and conspiracy theories. Some found nothing but demolished ruins and empty land. A few never returned, disappearances attributed to accidents but generating speculation about surviving plagas or cult members. The Spanish government maintained official position that the area was dangerous due to environmental contamination and that trespassers risked prosecution, but actual enforcement was spotty. Urban exploration forums online shared information about accessing the quarantine zone, trading tips on routes that avoided patrols, and speculation about what might be found in the ruins. Some explorers posted photos of demolished structures, graffiti covered concrete, overgrown paths leading nowhere, or others posted claims of finding evidence of cult activity, photos that were usually revealed as hoaxes but which generated discussion about what Los Illuminados had really been and what might remain of their operations. The truth, as Leon knew it, was that Los Illuminados was thoroughly destroyed as an organization. Sadler was dead, Salazar was dead, Mendez was dead. The cult's leadership had been killed and its facilities demolished. But organizations were more than their leaders and infrastructure. They were ideas, methodologies, accumulated knowledge. That knowledge had survived in documents recovered by intelligence agencies, in samples taken before destruction, in the minds of researchers who had worked with Las Plagas. Los Illuminados as a specific cult was dead, but what it represented persisted. New organizations formed, inspired by Los Illuminados' approach or independently developing similar capabilities. The bioweapon proliferation continued, accelerating, if anything, as more groups acquired samples and expertise. Leon found himself responding to incidents that echoed Spain in various ways: cults developing parasitic bioweapons, organizations attempting to infiltrate governments through infected agents, remote facilities where horrific research was conducted away from oversight. Each incident was unique in details but familiar in essential pattern. The work became a cycle of response and temporary containment. Knowing that permanent solutions remained elusive, Leon accepted this as the reality of bioterror defense. You couldn't eliminate the threat completely, but you could prevent individual incidents from becoming catastrophes. Each mission that succeeded meant people who got to live normal lives, unaware of the horrors that had been stopped before reaching them. That was victory enough, even if it didn't feel like victory while fighting through infected territories and watching allies die. Ashley's relationship with her father evolved in complex ways after Spain. The president felt enormous guilt about his daughter having been targeted because of his position, about her having endured trauma that resulted directly from choices he had made in his political career. Ashley struggled between resenting him for the danger his career had put her in and recognizing that he hadn't chosen for her to be kidnapped any more than she had chosen to be the president's daughter. They worked through these feelings over years of conversation and family therapy, eventually reaching understanding if not complete resolution. The president's appreciation for Leon was profound and lasting. Leon had saved his daughter at enormous personal risk, had completed a mission that seemed impossible, had brought Ashley home alive and free. The president ensured Leon received recognition within classified channels, promotions and commendations that couldn't be public, but which advanced his career significantly. He offered Leon positions with more authority and resources, opportunities to shape bioterror policy at high levels. Leon consistently declined these offers, preferring field work to administration. He was good at the practical aspects of bioterror response: infiltration, combat, tactical decision making under pressure. He was less interested in policy development and bureaucratic navigation that higher positions required. He understood his strengths and stayed in roles that utilized them, even when that meant declining advancement that others would have pursued eagerly. The recognition he valued most came from other operatives, people who understood what bioterror fieldwork required and who respected what Leon had accomplished. Chris Redfield's respect meant more than official commendations. Knowing that agents he trained survived their missions because of skills he had taught them mattered more than promotions. The work itself was the point, not the recognition or advancement that might come with it. Years later, when new agents asked Leon about Spain, he would tell them the truth without dramatization, a mission that had required everything he had, that had nearly cost him his identity and autonomy, that had succeeded through a combination of skill and luck that he couldn't reliably reproduce. He would explain that survival in bioterror situations required accepting that you might die, that the mission might fail, but continuing anyway because surrender guaranteed the worst outcomes. He would talk about Luis Serra, about redemption being possible even after terrible choices, about how people were more complicated than simple categories of good and evil allowed. He would discuss Krauser's betrayal, about how trauma and abandonment could corrupt even the most dedicated operatives, about the importance of supporting people who faced horrors that most couldn't imagine. And he would emphasize that missions like Spain weren't won by individual heroics, but by networks of people making critical contributions. Luis developing the treatment, Ada providing assistance at crucial moments, Hunnigan maintaining communication and support, even Ashley's courage in continuing forward despite being terrified. The mythology that developed around Leon within intelligence communities sometimes made him uncomfortable. Agents spoke about him with reverence that suggested someone more than human, someone who succeeded where others would fail not through effort and luck, but through some inherent superiority. Leon knew this wasn't true. He had advantages, experience from Raccoon City, excellent training, natural aptitude for tactical thinking. But he had also failed in ways that didn't make it into official reports. He had watched people die who he might have saved with different choices. He carried those failures alongside his successes. Ashley developed her own mythology in different circles, becoming a symbol of survival and resilience in advocacy spaces focused on trauma recovery. People who knew only the broad strokes of her experience, kidnapped, infected with something terrible, rescued and treated, saw her as proof that recovery was possible even from extreme trauma. She tried to live up to this perception while being honest about her ongoing struggles, about the nightmares that still came years later, about the ways Spain had permanently changed her. Her relationship with normal social connections remained complicated. Most people her age hadn't experienced anything remotely comparable to what she had survived. Their concerns about grades, relationships, career prospects felt simultaneously valid and trivial to her. She struggled to relate to people who hadn't faced mortality and violation in the way she had, while also recognizing that her experience didn't make her superior to them, just different in ways that created distance. She maintained friendships from before Spain, but those relationships changed as she did. Some friends couldn't handle the security requirements and constant agents that came with her life. Others couldn't navigate the gaps in Ashley's history, the classified experiences she couldn't discuss, the reason she sometimes reacted to situations in ways that seemed disproportionate without context they couldn't access. The friendships that survived were with people who could accept her, with those gaps and limitations, who didn't need to know everything to care about her. Leon's personal relationships faced similar challenges, complicated by both classification requirements and by the psychological burden of his work. Romantic relationships were particularly difficult. How did you build intimacy with someone when you couldn't discuss the experiences that defined you? How did you maintain normalcy when nightmares regularly shattered sleep and when work could call you away to classified locations for indefinite periods? Some operatives managed it, found partners who could accept the limitations and security concerns. Leon hadn't succeeded at that balance yet. His closest relationships were with other operatives who understood the work and its costs. Chris Redfield, despite their different organizational affiliations, became something like a friend through repeated collaboration. They would share drinks after joint operations, trading stories about missions that had gone wrong and about the absurdity of fighting bioweapons while governments pretended the threats didn't exist. They rarely discussed personal matters, but the professional respect and shared experience created bonds that felt meaningful. Claire Redfield, Chris's sister and Leon's ally from Raccoon City, maintained occasional contact with Leon over the years. She had taken a different path after Raccoon City, working with humanitarian organizations rather than military or intelligence agencies. Her perspective on bioterror response emphasized civilian protection and rights in ways that sometimes conflicted with Leon's more tactical approach. But they shared Raccoon City as foundational trauma, and that commonality created connection despite their different paths. Claire asked Leon about Spain once, knowing only that he had been involved in a classified operation that had gone badly. Leon couldn't provide details, but acknowledged that Spain had been worse than Raccoon City in some ways. Raccoon City had been about survival against overwhelming odds with death as the primary threat. Spain had been about maintaining autonomy while something inside him tried to take control, about fighting enemies while knowing he might become one of them. Both were traumatic, but Spain's horror was more personal, more violating. The comparison between virus threats like Raccoon City and parasite threats like Spain became a subject of tactical analysis in bioterror response training. Viruses typically killed hosts or reduced them to mindless undead, requiring containment strategies focused on preventing spread and eliminating infected individuals. Parasites like Las Plagas maintained host intelligence while controlling behavior, requiring different strategies that acknowledged infected individuals might appear normal while being compromised. Detection and response protocols had to account for these differences. Virus outbreaks could be identified through obvious symptoms: fever, aggressive behavior, physical transformation. Parasite infections might be invisible until maturity, infected individuals operating normally while the organism established control. This meant that parasite threats could spread further before detection, and that containment required more sophisticated surveillance and testing than virus outbreaks. The public health implications were profound. Virus outbreaks, terrible as they were, at least followed patterns that medical and emergency response systems understood: quarantine, vaccination, treatment protocols. These were known approaches even if the specific virus required adaptation. Parasitic mind control didn't fit existing frameworks. How did you quarantine someone who appeared healthy? How did you treat infection that was neurologically integrated rather than systemic? The answers were still being developed through painful experience. Leon's contribution to developing these frameworks came primarily through case studies and training. His experience in Spain provided the most complete documentation of extended operations in Plagas-infected territory, making it invaluable for understanding how parasitic infections spread and how infected populations behaved. His tactical decisions, when to engage infected individuals, when to avoid combat, how to identify Plagas emergence signs, became baseline procedures taught to new agents. The equipment he had used and found effective also became standard issue. The combination of firearms, explosives, An environmental adaptation that had kept him alive in Spain was codified into loadout recommendations. The importance of maintaining mobility, of not becoming trapped in defensive positions, of using terrain and structures tactically. These lessons from Leon's experience shaped how agents were trained to operate in hostile bioweapon environments. Ashley's experience contributed different lessons focused on protecting civilians during bioterror incidents. Her perspective as someone who had been targeted, infected, and traumatized provided insights that operatives and planners might miss. She emphasized in her advocacy work that bioterror response had to account for civilian psychological needs, not just tactical objectives. Rescue wasn't complete when people were physically extracted. It required ongoing support for trauma, recovery, and reintegration. Her advocacy led to improved protocols for civilian support during and after bioterror incidents. Medical teams were trained in trauma-informed approaches to treating survivors. Psychological support was integrated into extraction procedures rather than added afterward. Security protocols were developed that protected survivors without making them feel imprisoned. These improvements came directly from Ashley's articulation of what she had needed during and after Spain, needs that hadn't been adequately met in ways that had made her recovery harder. The broader pattern was that bioterror response was evolving through accumulated experience from incidents like Raccoon City and Spain. Each incident revealed gaps in preparedness and capability, gaps that were then addressed through new protocols, equipment, and training. The process was reactive rather than proactive, always responding to threats that had already caused casualties rather than predicting and preventing future incidents. But reactive improvement was better than no improvement, and the capabilities developed after each incident meant that subsequent responses were somewhat more effective. By the time a decade had passed since Spain, the bioterror threat landscape had changed substantially. Organizations like the BSAA had matured, developing global response networks and specialized capabilities. International cooperation had improved, if imperfectly, with nations recognizing that bioweapon threats transcended borders and required coordinated responses. Detection and containment protocols had been refined through painful experience. Treatment options had expanded as research into various bioweapons yielded medical countermeasures. But the fundamental problem persisted. Bioweapon development was too accessible and too profitable to eliminate. Every incident that was successfully contained created samples and knowledge that proliferated to new actors. Every organization that was destroyed spawned successors who learned from their predecessors' mistakes. The threat couldn't be eliminated, only managed through constant vigilance and response. Leon had made peace with this reality by that point. He had entered the field after Raccoon City, thinking that bioterror was something that could be defeated, that Umbrella's destruction would end the threat. Spain had taught him that bioweapons were a permanent part of the global security landscape, that new organizations would always emerge to exploit the technology. Acceptance of that reality didn't mean surrender. He continued working, training, responding to incidents, but it meant understanding that his work would never truly be finished. Ashley reached similar acceptance through her advocacy work. She had initially believed that raising awareness about bioterror threats would generate political will for permanent solutions. Over time, she recognized that while awareness helped improve response capabilities, it couldn't eliminate the fundamental problem that hostile actors would always seek weapons that provided asymmetric advantage. Her advocacy shifted from seeking elimination of the threat to ensuring robust response capabilities and survivor support systems. Their occasional communications in later years reflected this shared understanding. They would exchange messages on the anniversary of their escape from Spain, simple acknowledgments that they remembered and were thinking of each other. The messages never discussed details. Both were aware that electronic communications weren't fully secure, but the sentiment was clear. They had survived something terrible together, and that bond persisted despite years and distance and different life paths. Leon sometimes wondered if they might have developed different relationship if circumstances had been different, if they had met in normal ways rather than through trauma. But speculation about alternate paths was pointless. They were who they were because of what they had experienced, and Spain was too fundamental to their identities to imagine a way. The relationship they had, distant, professional, built on shared survival, was appropriate to their circumstances, even if it wasn't what either might have chosen in different life. The agents Leon trained began having their own experiences with Plagas incidents, reporting back about how the training had prepared them or where it had fallen short. Leon incorporated their feedback into updated training protocols, the curriculum evolving as more people survived encounters with parasitic bioweapons and contributed lessons learned. The training became more sophisticated, more nuanced, better calibrated to actual threat patterns rather than theoretical scenarios. Some of Leon's trainees died in the field, casualties of missions that went wrong despite preparation and skill. Leon attended their memorial services when possible, standing with other veterans who understood that death in bioterror response was always possible, regardless of training or experience. He struggled with guilt about whether better training might have saved them, whether lessons he had failed to convey adequately had contributed to their deaths. His colleagues assured him that some missions simply went wrong, that casualties weren't always preventable, but the guilt persisted. The work extracted its price from everyone involved. Physical wounds healed eventually, but psychological damage accumulated. Every operative Leon knew carried trauma from missions that had required more than anyone should have to give. Some managed it better than others. Some eventually broke under the accumulated weight and had to leave the field. Leon himself came close to breaking several times, saved by combination of stubborn persistence and support from people who recognized when he was struggling. Therapy helped, when he could find therapists with sufficient clearance to discuss classified experiences. The specialized mental health support for intelligence and special operations personnel had improved significantly after incidents like Spain highlighted how inadequate previous support had been. Therapists who understood operational stress, who could work with clients unable to discuss details of their experiences, became more available. Leon used these resources reluctantly at first, viewing therapy as admission of weakness, but eventually recognized that managing psychological damage was as important as treating physical wounds. Ashley's therapy was extensive and ongoing, addressing not just Spain but the broader impact of living with security threats and public attention. Her therapists helped her develop frameworks for processing trauma while maintaining functionality, for accepting limitations without surrendering to them, for building identity that included but wasn't defined entirely by what she had survived. The work was difficult and never completely finished, but it allowed her to create meaningful life despite the permanent changes Spain had caused. Both Leon and Ashley eventually reached a point where Spain was integrated into their identities rather than dominating them. The experience would always be part of who they were, would always inform their perspectives and reactions, but it became one element among many rather than the single defining trauma. They had survived, recovered to a degree that recovery was possible, and built lives that included purpose and connection and occasional moments of genuine peace. The village in Spain remained empty and quarantined, gradually being reclaimed by nature as vegetation grew over demolished structures and animals returned to territory that humans had abandoned. Eventually, the site would be indistinguishable from surrounding wilderness, the evidence of what had occurred there buried under soil and plants. Future generations might never know that a cult had operated there, that parasitic bioweapons had been developed there, that a government agent had fought through infected villages while himself being transformed into one of them. The castle ruins remain visible, weathered stone marking where the Salazar family legacy had ended in catastrophic failure. Tourists occasionally visited the site, taking photos of the dramatic architecture while guides told sanitized histories. The truth about Ramon Salazar's choices and Los Illuminados operations remained classified, protected by agreements between Spanish and U.S. governments. The castle became a monument to something visitors didn't fully understand, beautiful and tragic and haunted by secrets. The island where Sadler had built his primary facility eroded slowly into the sea, structures collapsing as foundations undermined by explosions failed completely. Navigation charts marked it as hazardous, and ships avoided the area. Eventually, it would disappear entirely beneath the waves, the physical evidence of Los Illuminados' ambitions consumed by ocean. But the knowledge survived in scattered documents and in the minds of survivors and in genetic sequences of plaga samples preserved in laboratories around the world. Leon Kennedy continued his work, taking on missions that required his specific experience and skills, training new agents, contributing to evolving understanding of bioterror threats. He aged into veteran status, the years adding gray to his hair and weight to his movements, but not diminishing his capabilities enough to force retirement. He became an institutional memory for his agency, someone who had survived incidents that were already becoming history, whose experience spanned from Umbrella's bioweapons to Los Illuminados parasites to whatever threats would emerge next. Ashley Graham built her life around advocacy and policy work, using her platform to push for improvements in bioterror response and survivor support. She maintained security protocols that protected her from ongoing threats while working to expand public understanding of issues that most people preferred not to think about. She never married, the combination of security concerns and psychological barriers making romantic relationships too complicated. But she built meaningful connections with people in her advocacy work and maintained friendships that sustained her. And sometimes, on quiet nights when sleep wouldn't come easily, both Leon and Ashley would remember Spain, would remember fog-shrouded villages and Gothic castles, and facilities where terrible things had been developed, would remember the feeling of something growing inside them, preparing to steal their autonomy and turn them into weapons, would remember fighting to maintain themselves against infection that seemed inevitable, would remember the radiation chamber that had destroyed the parasites in agony that they could still feel years later. But they would also remember surviving, remember making it out when so many others hadn't, remember that despite everything Los Illuminados had done, despite Sadler's plans and the parasites' control and the odds that had been stacked against them, they had escaped and recovered and lived. That memory of survival against terrible odds became foundation for everything they built afterward. Spain had tried to destroy them, had come terrifyingly close to succeeding, but ultimately they had endured, and that was enough. Not victory in any complete sense. The threat persisted, the nightmares continued, the scars remained, but survival was its own form of triumph. They had faced bioterror horror at its most personal and violating, had been infected and used and nearly lost, and had fought their way back to autonomy and life. Whatever came next in their respective journeys, they carried that knowledge. They had survived the worst and could face what followed with the strength that survival had forged. The story of Resident Evil 4 wasn't ultimately about defeating evil or eliminating threats permanently. It was about endurance and adaptation and the stubborn human refusal to surrender even when circumstances seemed hopeless. It was about Leon Kennedy driving into hostile territory to rescue someone he'd never met and fighting through impossible odds because that was what his duty required. It was about Ashley Graham maintaining her will against parasitic infection through sheer determination not to become a weapon against her country. It was about Luis Serra recognizing his mistakes and sacrificing himself to help others escape the horror he had helped create. It was about Ada Wong making choices that remained enigmatic, but which had tilted the balance when it mattered most. About Jack Krauser's tragic fall from decorated operative to enemy, driven by grievances that were understandable even as his actions became unforgivable. About Ramon Salazar's manipulation by Sadler, youth and isolation making him vulnerable to promises of purpose. About Osmond Sadler himself, charismatic leader whose vision of paradise through parasitic infection came close to realization before being stopped. And it was about what came after, about how survivors integrated trauma into their lives and continued forward despite permanent changes to who they were, about how organizations adapted and improved based on painful lessons from incidents that had cost lives, about how threats evolved and proliferated even as response capabilities developed to counter them, about the ongoing struggle between those who would weaponize biology and those who fought to contain those weapons and protect people from their effects. The story continued beyond Spain in missions Leon undertook and operations Ashley influenced, and in the work of countless others responding to bioterror threats around the world. Each incident added chapters, each survivor contributed verses, each casualty was mourned by people who understood that they had died facing threats that most would never know existed. The story wasn't finished and wouldn't be finished, not as long as hostile actors sought asymmetric advantages through biological weapons, and not as long as people like Leon and Ashley stood against them. But the chapter that was Spain had concluded. The mission was complete, the cult destroyed, the immediate threat neutralized. Leon and Ashley had survived and recovered and moved forward into whatever came next. And on the anniversary of their escape, they would remember and acknowledge what they had endured together, the bond forged in that Spanish nightmare that connected them across years and distance and different life paths. The fog had lifted from those Spanish villages eventually. The parasites were dead or scattered. The cult's facilities were demolished or buried. The people who had been infected were treated or had died. The region slowly returned to something resembling normalcy, though the truth about what had occurred there remained classified and hidden. Life continued, as it always did after catastrophe, changed but persistent, and Leon Kennedy and Ashley Graham continued with it, carrying Spain with them always but not imprisoned by it, survivors who had faced the darkest horror bioterrorism offered and had emerged into daylight on the far shore, exhausted and scarred but fundamentally themselves. That was the triumph Spain couldn't take from them, their essential humanity, maintained through infection and trauma and terror. They remained who they were, and that was victory enough.